Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Cindy Held. I work with KEXAC, and I am the Assistant Director for Communication and Development. And this session is with Eric Kennedy. He's going to be telling us about 2021 legislative updates and impacts to students and school districts. We do have a chat feature if you have any questions. I usually do have everybody muted during the session, but if you're not able to use the chat, you can definitely unmute yourself and chime in if you do have a question along the way. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Eric Kennedy. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, I will go ahead and get started. And Cindy, you can just chime in if anything ever is a problem or you need to. Again, really quickly, for the hour that we are together, I'll introduce myself and just get right underway. I'm Eric Kennedy. My title is the Director of Advocacy for the Kentucky School Boards Association. Of course, the KSBA is one of the K groups that we all know, one of the acronyms in education here in Kentucky. Our members are the 5, or in one district, the 7 locally elected school board members in each district, and the superintendent, who is part of the board team that we like to call it. Those are our direct members. In my role as Director of Advocacy, most of what I do is I lobby the General Assembly and the State Board of Education and KDE more than anything else on the interest of not just our members, not just the interest of school board members specifically, but really the interest of the district and, of course, the students ultimately. Of all the K groups out there, of all of the different constituency associations that lobby and advocate in Frankfort and Washington, we like to see KSBA as the one that's sort of for the district as an entity, the district as a thing, more so than just the superintendent's group or the teachers or the principals and so on and so forth. We are the only one that really sort of looks at the district as a legal entity. So sometimes there are issues in Frankfort that might touch on finances or legal liability and things that really kind of falls to us to lobby around more so than any of the other specific groups. So we're going to talk about the last regular session of the Kentucky General Assembly in this session. I'm going to share my screen in a moment and bring up the PowerPoint that I believe all of you have access to somehow in the materials for this conference. I went through the last session, which ran basically from January to the end of March. It already feels like a million years ago now, and some of this feels like ancient history. I went through all of the bills that were filed and all of the bills that passed, and tried to pick out the ones that most directly involved school districts, school district operations, alternative education programs that all of you work in, to really highlight those in this session. I'm not going to go through all of the bills, certainly. Many more bills impacted education in some way that I'm not even going to touch on because of, education, as I sometimes say, everything could impact a school district in one way or the other. Everything from tax law and the budget to education-specific things such as curriculum, everything all the way down. One of the bills I'm going to mention involves pesticides. In one way or another, from employment law to tax law to education, the role that education and school districts have, just everything can have some possible impact on it. So with that, with no further ado, let me share my screen. I'm now one of those people that it looks like I don't know how to use PowerPoint.
It works. I can see it.
Okay. So is your entire screen just the first slide, or do you see the next slide also?
I just see the whole slide. So
perfect.
First slide. Yeah.
Perfect. It's a miracle. Okay, so we'll get underway, and I'll keep an eye on the time as well. As you said, all throughout the presentation, if it's difficult to stop me and ask a question, I won't be able to always see things in the chat, but we will have time at the end and I can see questions that come in or comments, and we can even go back to the slides if we need to. Okay, as I said, I will highlight some of the education-related legislation that passed during this last regular session. It was an odd year session. 2021 is an odd numbered year, which means that there were only 30 session days, or there were 30 days where the State House and State Senate went into the Senate and House chambers and actually gavelled into session and voted on bills. The even year sessions, such as the next one that will come up in January of 2022, is twice as long. There are 60 working days in those sessions when they take up a budget and a lot more bills. This short session, all of the bills that we will mention in this presentation took effect either on or before June 29th. So everything we'll talk about in this session is something that passed and something that has taken effect. A couple of things that I actually took out of the presentation and won't spend much time on. There were some other bills that passed which have not taken effect only because they're all tied up in court. A couple of bills were passed that would change the emergency powers that the governor has to issue emergency orders, not just about COVID, but about any kind of emergency. House Bill 1 was something that changed his emergency powers and really impacted education directly. It would, in various ways, allow a local school district more control over how it operated during a state of emergency, if it was in person or not, and kind of reduced the powers that the governor or any future governor might have to have an impact on, for example, closing all of the schools to in-person learning. Some of that was in, like I said, House Bill 1. That is currently sitting in court. It is being challenged in court. Our state Supreme Court has that lawsuit. At almost any time, they could issue an opinion on that, and there's really we have no idea when they might do so, so we're kind of in limbo. So I took any bills like that are tied up in court, I took out, since it's hard for us to know what exactly will happen or when it will happen. So going quickly through some of them, Senate Bill 5 deals with the COVID pandemic. Senate Bill 5 deals with legal liability on school districts, individual school board members, and individual school district employees, from teacher right on up to superintendent. Going way back to when the pandemic first really began and we first closed up in-person learning way back in March of 2020, throughout that year, throughout the summer, as school boards were trying to figure out how we would open up and have another school year, if we would be in person or not, what all of the mitigation steps we would have to take if we were in person, keeping the desks 6 feet apart in every classroom or 3 feet apart, and who would wear masks. And then all throughout the year last year, so much of the guidance kept changing. Sometimes the guidance from either the state or federal government agencies would change on a daily basis. Some of it would change even more than once during a single day. Some of the guidance was just recommendations for things that school districts could or could not do. Some of it was requirements and mandates that you didn't have any choice over. Even up until this day, that situation was all throughout the pandemic. It is still going on. So at a certain point, our school districts, our school boards, superintendents, and all the way down to principals and everyone, we really got to be concerned that we would be trying to do everything right. You would be trying to follow all of the guidance, but it was changing so much that was very difficult. And if someone were to get sick with COVID and if they were to believe that they caught it at school, we were concerned that they would sue an individual employee and say, well, you didn't wipe down a doorknob the way you were supposed to under this one piece of guidance. Or they would sue the district or individual school board members and say, well, you should have closed schools and you didn't. And proving that and defending a lawsuit like that would be so timely and costly and so difficult when, in good faith, we were trying to follow guidance that was so conflicting and always changing. KSBA lobbied pretty hard for Senate Bill 5 to pass, and it did so. It provides temporary, narrowly tailored legal liability protection for districts, school boards, and employees only for legal lawsuits arising out of COVID-19 specifically. One specific piece of language in that bill, especially that might be important for some of you all in any of the alternative education programs that are so diverse across the state, there was some language in there not just about someone suing and saying, well, I got sick and I wouldn't have gotten sick if I wasn't at school. Perhaps a parent might sue and say, well, my child was doing an online program, whether it was Zoom or Teams or whatever, and the teacher maybe broke them out into breakout groups in Zoom. And while my student was only with 3 or 4 other kids in a Zoom class and their teacher was not able to be in their little breakout at that moment, one of the other kids said something or bullied them. That kind of a legal claim that might arise, of course, wouldn't be typical in a normal year when COVID wasn't happening and school was just in person, where a teacher would be able to be there watching over all of the students. That is a very unique thing that no one could have foreseen happening this way, but that might possibly come up during COVID. So the bullet point there on your screen was really important, where it talks about giving us some extra legal protections, including responsibilities that require changes to the educational environment in which they typically operate. To my knowledge, no district in Kentucky has been sued yet on any of the kinds of things that I'm describing. It may or may not happen, but just know that if and when something like that happens, we have some extra protections than normal when we were acting in good faith. Senate Bill 79 deals with the Public Employee Deferred Compensation Authority, sort of those kind of the 401k type accounts that the state program, the State Deferred Comp Authority operates, not just for state government employees, but for basically all employees out in the school districts. As a matter of fact, a lot of people are surprised when I say that the single largest group of employees that have accounts in the State Deferred Comp program are teachers, specifically out in all of the 171 school districts. So any change to that program is important for us to keep track of. This bill allows those folks with the Deferred Comp Authority to start providing financial planning services to anyone with an account with them. They really haven't gotten that up and running yet, but I think they will. And that is, if you have an account with them, look for that possibly coming in the future. Senate Bill 80 deals with law enforcement officers, including school resource officers, and it changes the process for decertification of law enforcement officers, no matter who they work for anywhere in Kentucky, from city police to the state police and county sheriff's deputies, including any school resource officers, any SROs in any school facility. It really kind of clarifies the various crimes, acts, and omissions that could possibly get any individual officer decertified to be able to work as a law enforcement officer in Kentucky. It also changes some of the training that they are to take. The issue we have is a backlog. There is a tremendous backlog of newly hired officers that are trying to get their first basic training done to really take on their job duties. There is a limited capacity for that training to be offered, and there's a big backlog where, for example, a city police department may have given an offer of employment to lots of officers, but they can't actually start yet because of this backlog in training. This bill kind of gave us some flexibility so that folks can get training in new ways and take under their new job. But for any of you, there are more and more SROs out in all of our school districts because of the school safety legislation that's passed the last couple of years. So now this is something we wouldn't really have paid much attention to in the past, but now anything dealing with law enforcement officers getting certified or decertified is one more thing that impacts school districts we have to pay attention to. Senate Bill 101 deals with career and technical education funding, how the state provides funding for CTE education, not only out in the districts, in district-operated programs, but also by the state ATCs, the state-operated area tech centers. For several years now, because of primarily budget cuts, there has been a movement from several state legislators in particular to move the state-operated centers down to school districts and for local school boards to take over the operation of some of those state centers. That has happened in several cases in the last few years. This bill, Senate Bill 101, puts in place a financial incentive, hoping that more school boards take over some more of the state-operated centers to get the Department of Ed basically out of the business of directly operating schools like this. As you can see in that second bullet point, if a local board assumes control of a state-operated center in any time during those 3 school years, it has to notify KDE that they plan to take over the center on or before December 31st of this year. If they do that, if they notify the department that they are interested and they want to take over a state center by that deadline, then they can actually negotiate the terms for that and do all of the work to actually complete the takeover. And if they do, they will get 100% of what the state would have given to operate that center if the state kept control of it for the first year, and then 75% of that funding each year thereafter. Basically, long story short, that is more money than or otherwise would be provided when a local takes over a state center. There is therefore some level of financial incentive for boards to continue or to consider doing this. There is some more detail on kind of how this would work. If a state-operated center serves more than one district, then any time a local board takes it over, they would have to continue serving the other districts that were served by that state center before they took it over. And the bill provides that any staff, any employees at a state-operated center who had any kind of tenure contract status have to maintain that protected tenure status after any given local board takes it over. A lot of these provisions were already in place the last few years in the budget bill, but the budget bill is always a temporary piece of legislation that expires kind of every 2 years. Senate Bill 101 made some of that permanent forever, and I think we will see a lot of boards take over some of these state ATCs in the next bit of time. Senate Bill 127, we're pretty good on time. Senate Bill 127 deals with basically what we typically call rescue inhalers or bronchodilator rescue inhalers kept in school districts and school facilities. There are already several things in statute that deal with EpiPens and encourages schools to keep EpiPens on hand. And there's another statute that encourages school districts to keep the defibrillator devices on hand, kind of in rescue boxes up on the wall somewhere in the school. Senate Bill 127 puts that same language in place for these rescue inhalers. It does not require schools to put them in place, but encourages schools to keep them in place at least in 2 locations somewhere in the school. And then if you choose to do so, if the school district chooses to do that, it has some parameters on exactly where they would have to be and how they would have to be used. It also changes the actual name of the devices in statute. The statute used to actually say EpiPen for the other devices that are in the same statute that we're putting these rescue inhalers in. Well, we had to go back and change that because EpiPen is a actual proprietary name. It's like a trademarked name of a specific company. Like anything else, there's name brand and then there's sort of generic brand. The statute wanted to no longer limit you only to just the EpiPen, so it changed the name of those kinds of devices, which will actually expand the universe of devices that we can actually use in schools under the statute. Very often there are shortages of EpiPens, but you can find one of the generics, for example. So that was a good change. It's now, I think, more likely that we will have all of those devices in schools because, of course, as I said, it's not a requirement, but they encourage you to do it. That brings us to Senate Bill 128, the Supplemental School Year Bill. A lot of this, in some ways, a lot of this bill has already kind of come and gone. The application process for students who wanted to have a supplemental school year has already passed the deadline for them to ask for one. The deadline for local school boards to approve requests or not has already passed. So now we're really in the phase of actually doing it. This next school year, actually allowing students who asked for it and were in a district where the board approved it to consider next year as a supplemental school year. So a lot of the bullet points here in the next couple of slides that summarize what this bill did aren't necessarily important for us to pay attention to now in terms of the application process and so forth. We do not have the final numbers all put together on which districts approved their students to use a supplemental school year. It was not all of them. I think it was kind of roughly half and half scattered across the state. A lot of that depended on how many students asked for it and what grade levels they were in. In many cases, the school district would be able to provide students with this supplemental year if just a handful of kids in the whole district asked for it and if they were kind of scattered all throughout grade levels. Whereas if every single high school student in the entire district asked to have an extra year, and yet you also had an incoming class of freshmen, you may not have enough space or personnel or funding to do that. So based more than anything on who was asking, how many kids it was, what grade levels they were in, and the resources each district had, you had some school boards approve them or deny the requests. So as you see there, as I said, the deadline for students to ask for it has passed. If you did not ask for it, you cannot ask for it now. The deadline for each local elected school board to approve them or not has passed. The deadline of June 16th, whereby it says a local board that approved all of the kids who asked for it to have an extra year, then the board had to put together its plan for what that would look like. Any special rules or special policies the board would put in place only for those students and for a supplemental year. To the extent you had anything special, all of those had to be put together and sent up to KDE by June 16th. So that deadline has also passed. A lot of folks assumed that this was mostly about athletics and that most of the students that would want it would be asking for it for athletic competition reasons. I spoke recently with Julian Tackett, the commissioner of KHSAA, and I said, well, what does it look like on your end? The information you have so far on the numbers of students that are going to do this, how many of them does it look so far are also participating in athletics at the high school level? And it was actually not an overwhelming number. It was not all of them, or even, I don't believe it was even a substantial majority. Kind of a relatively small number, actually, it looks like right now, are falling under that category. Because, frankly, a lot of rules were not changed. A lot of the existing rules on eligibility for athletics were not changed by this law. And the NCAA in Division I athletics in college did not change any of their rules for a student graduating high school within a certain time frame and being eligible to play in Division I in college. NCAA said, we're not changing anything. So if you take an extra year in high school, you may knock yourself out of eligibility for Division I in college. Well, a lot of students, a lot of student athletes, that is their dream and their plan. So they actually did not ask for a supplemental year when they learned that was happening. So as you see there, I mentioned how some of the existing rules about athletics were not changed. I think that's probably why we didn't see such an overwhelming number. Many of you will be in a district that either did or did not approve this. You might have students that will or will not be considered next year as a supplemental school year. So that is something to kind of ask for locally. If you don't already know, maybe just call into central office and ask if your board approved that or not and kind of how many kids it was. There is no one single listing at the state level yet of all of that information. Okay, now moving to some House bills. House Bill 9 deals with the County Employees Retirement System, CERS. That system is what all local school district employees who are classified employees, that is the pension system that they are in, CERS. Largely, it's everyone except teachers in a school district is in the CERS pension system. This bill, House Bill 9, made a lot of changes to implement some legislation that was passed the prior session in Frankfort that created an all-new board of trustees that would manage and oversee the CERS pension system. For many years, for decades, just to explain what that means, one board of trustees that we called the KRS, the Kentucky Retirement Systems Board of Trustees, one group of people was overseeing and managing all of the investments and all of the operations for the C pension system and the state employee pension system and the state police pension system. Well, over time, the state plans got much more underfunded than the CERS plan that our folks were in. So a lot of changes were happening. A lot of decisions were being made about investments, sometimes that we felt at KSBA were more to the benefit and more in the interest of the state plans that were even more underfunded than the C plan. And we sort of felt that the management should be separated. So we strongly advocated for the legislation that passed, which now has in place a board of trustees only for the C plan that is only looking out for it, only making decisions that impact it and how that money is invested. We think that is very important because the systems are very different. The new CERS board came into existence back on April 1st. It is in place now. And when that happened, the name of the administrative staff, all of the employees and the staff that operate all of the systems, stayed the same. We got a new board of trustees, but all of the staff stayed the same. Think of it almost like in a school district. If for some reason your local school board stayed in place, but a new separate school board only to manage the high schools in the district was created, but all of the employees and all of the staff of the school district stayed the same, and you didn't separate out all the employees. That's sort of like what happened here. So all of the administrative staff, that agency has changed names. For anyone on this webinar, for any of your coworkers out in the district who are classified folks who are in the CERS system, it's very important for them to realize that they may get information, they may get things mailed to them at their house, they may get emails from the staff of their pension system that look different with a new name and a new logo. KRS is now the KPPA. It is now called the Kentucky Public Pensions Authority. So that is still the staff that is operating the CERS pension systems. Okay. While we are talking about pensions, I wanted to take this opportunity, especially knowing that all of you folks are by and large employees out in the district statewide, to mention that if you have any questions about your pension benefits, there is no substitute for you asking the staff at either the KPPA, if you are in CERS, or at TRS, the Teachers Retirement System, for all of the teachers and certified staff. The contact information for those two separate systems is here now on your slide. On the left side, if you are in CERS, the KPPA website is there. You can email that email address with questions specific to you and your benefits and your account. You can access your account if you've set it up at that web address, myretirement.ky.gov, or call that 1-800 number. Over on the right-hand side of the screen, that is the contact information for TRS, the Teachers Retirement System. You can access your account at the address you see there or call that 1-800 number to set up an appointment with one of the TRS counselors. The reason why I'm making this point is because one of the biggest issues we have, honestly, with all discussions, all of the discussions around pensions and pension reform and when someone can retire and how much they'll earn, what the return to work provisions are. You know, if you retire and you want to go back as a substitute teacher, when you can do that and what the rules are. So many people ask questions about that, especially on social media. There are several social media groups that are out there where people will post, either they'll directly post or they'll post anonymously a question. Then literally hundreds of comments will go by for days and days or weeks trying to answer this question. I am on some of those groups and I see a lot of those posts, and I can tell you 98% of the comments are incorrect, or they're actually talking about something else that was not the question. So much incorrect information swirls when people ask sometimes individual questions like, what will I make when I retire? Can I go back to work or not if I retire? That I just always urge everyone, there is, as I said, that's what I mean when I say there is no substitute for talking to the staff at those two agencies. You will get accurate information. You will tamp down some of the incorrect information or the rumors that are out there. That is just so critically important that I always urge everyone to do that. When in doubt, go directly to the source of those agencies. Recently, there was a big kind of exhausting miscommunication that happened where the TRS had to put out an official communication only to correct all of these incorrect statements floating around social media. And when that happened, kind of humorously, I put out on the KSBA Twitter feed, I said, if I buy something at Walmart and I want to return it, I call Walmart and ask what their return policy is. I don't just ask my friends on Facebook or call Kroger and ask what the Walmart return policy is. So I just make that point anytime I'm talking to anyone out in the schools. Please do not make a life-altering, permanent decision on something like when you're going to retire unless you talk to those counselors based on what some folks said on a Facebook post. Okay, but moving off that point now to some other bills, and then I'll check the chat near the end for any questions. House Bill 133 passed. It deals with local school board taxes to generate revenue to operate our school districts. It reduced the number of signatures that would be needed to possibly have a recall petition of a school board tax increase. As many of you know, local school boards are elected and they have taxing power that is limited in many ways. If a school board wanted to increase taxes at a certain level, they are very limited in what the increase they can have before it's possible for folks in that district to circulate a petition and get enough signatures to put that on the ballot. And then at the next election, everyone in town that lives in that school district can vote yes or no on the tax increase. Well, because of a pretty high profile tax increase that happened in one large district about a couple of years ago, the legislature now reduced the number of signatures you would need to get in order to have a tax recall put on the ballot, only in some at a certain level. As you see there, it cut it down to 5,000 registered qualified voters living in the district, or 10% of the total number of votes cast in the last presidential election, whichever is less. What that really means is the effect that has is only in our larger school districts would this operate so that it would actually, based on how many people voted in the last election, this change would reduce the number of signatures you would need only in a few of our largest school districts. And I write them down there. So now in Boone, Fayette, Jefferson, Kenton, and Warren counties, if any of those school boards wanted to increase a tax beyond a certain level, basically it would be easier and more likely that someone would get enough signatures to put that tax increase on the ballot. Moving now to the state budget bill. Normally in an odd year budget like 2021, they would not have passed a budget, but they had to this time because the prior year they shut everything down early because of COVID, and they only passed a 1-year budget instead of a 2-year. So when they came back this session, they had to pass another budget for this year that just began July 1st, a few weeks ago. House Bill 192 is the state executive branch budget for this biennium, this period of time. Really, the only changes now are for the rest of this year that just began July 1, the rest of this fiscal year. Generally, P12, which is of course preschool through 12th grade education, was funded in this budget like what we call a continuation budget. That means that most of the programs and most of the line items were funded at the same amount that they were already at in the prior school year. Not a lot of things in schools were increased or decreased in this budget. This includes the KECSAC line item. So probably, I am assuming that all of you on this webinar probably teach or work in some way in an alternative education setting that is a KECSAC program, probably. So therefore, probably most of you know that there for many, many years, there is, sorry, I'm getting text messages and I'm looking, some of this is from people watching this webinar with questions. So as you know, the state budget bill for many years has had a line item, a specific provision providing state funding for KECSAC programs. This funding, most of this funding flows directly down to the school districts that have a KECSAC program. Really, it's extra money to pay for things like the smaller teacher-student ratio, the extra school, the days of school in the year, the extended school calendar that the KECSAC programs operate on. To help districts pay for that, there is some additional state funding. Doesn't fully fund it, any of it, of course, but that KECSAC line item stayed at the same level as it was the prior year. Just some of the important things in the budget bill I pulled out to focus on here. The SEEK base, guaranteed base amount per pupil stayed the same at $4,000 a pupil. That is just the first step in the SEEK formula. The SEEK formula is very complicated, and as most of you probably know, when you see that the budget has the base amount per pupil of $4,000, that does not mean that every kid in Kentucky has their name put on an envelope and $4,000 is put into that envelope and it goes out to the district they go to school at. There are lots of adjustments up and down, and each school district might get more or less than $4,000 from Frankfort based on a lot of other parts of the formula. But the starting place, the most important thing, is that amount which stayed the same. I won't read all of this, and some of this is not really critical or important for any of you all to focus on. I will mention a couple of things. There were no school district employee raises provided or funded or required in this budget. But of course, we know that many school districts are providing raises this year, either from local money or from some federal money they may have. $7.4 million was provided in this year, in this budget, to help pay for additional school-based mental health services providers out in the districts. That money comes through grants from the Center for School Safety. This budget provided $1.1 million so that we could open up 24 new Frisky centers, family resource centers, in schools where by formula they were eligible to have funding, but they didn't have enough. So we're going to have 24 new centers open up. It provides $800,000 to expand the Dolly Parton Imagination Library to more communities across the state. It's already in many communities with local fundraising, so we think more of those will open up. Let me see. The pension systems were all fully funded at the ARC level, the actuarially required contribution level. Basically, the actuaries, the outside experts that work for the pension systems that say, based on how many people and inflation and based on the investment returns, the state needs to put in X amount of money this year. That estimated level was fully funded in this budget, which is critically important. And the budget increased the money for more AP tests for students who otherwise couldn't afford to take the AP test on a first come, first served basis. That's very important as well. So there was a lot of good news in this budget. Certainly it's not, a lot of things could have a lot of extra funding that we advocate for, certainly, but there was a lot of good news in this budget. But next session, when they come back into Frankfort in January of 2022, they will have to do another budget for the next 2 years in 2-year period of time. So we'll be right back advocating for increases in some of these programs, including the KEXAC program. All right, moving on, we are good on time. House Bill 208 passed. That was another bill that dealt with COVID issues specifically and COVID operations in schools. This bill was very important to us. We supported it very strongly. It gave us a lot of flexibility in several areas of school operations so that we could finish out last school year without everything changing right at the very end, dealing with COVID. A lot of what it did was already in place from the prior year, Senate Bill 177 that passed right when the pandemic first started. Back when it first started, we didn't know it would last this long. So they gave us some flexibility over things, including like emergency days for school staff that might have to quarantine. When they first did it, it was only for that school year. Well, this time last year during the summer, the pandemic was still going on. We started school. We had the entire school year last year, and we still needed a lot of that flexibility. So House Bill 208 kept a lot of those things in place for all of last school year. However, this also is temporary. So a lot of the things in this bill, including the things like unlimited emergency leave days, do not apply going forward into the next school year that we're all about to start here in just a couple of weeks in some places. So we will wait and see if we have to come back and get some of this continued again next session. House Bill 210, I'll mention briefly, deals with adoption and giving employees paid leave when they adopt a child. I mention that just because, frankly, adoption is near and dear to my heart. I'm an adoptive parent. But also I wanted to make sure that everyone understand that this mostly deals with the private sector. All of the employees, by and large, across Kentucky in the private sector now have to provide a certain amount of paid leave to adoptive parents, the same as biological birth parents. This was already the case in public schools. All of our public school districts already had a law that required essentially the same level of paid leave for employees that adopt. Here's one of my favorite bills to mention just because it illustrates the point I made at the beginning of the webinar. House Bill 236 deals with pesticides. It changes the licensing requirements for how people can use and apply pesticides and fertilizer. And you might be wondering, why in the world is Eric talking about how we put down pesticide and fertilizer in an alternative education webinar? This just illustrates my point that this applies to school districts. All of your school districts, by and large, use pesticide in the building and out on the grounds. This is just one more example of how everything, almost every bill, one way or another, could impact school districts. There's so much for all of us to track and keep track of. This is just one more thing that somewhere at central office, your facilities staff now has to keep track of whether or not they've paid a $10 annual license fee for their employees who put down pesticides in all the buildings. Back to pensions for a moment. House Bill 258 made a lot of changes to the teachers' pension system. This created a new tier of benefits in the teachers' retirement system, TRS, only for new hires who first enter the system on or after January 1, 2022. This is only for brand new people that have never been in TRS before. If you've even been a substitute teacher at some point in the past, you are already in the TRS system and you will not see any changes in your benefit structure. Only for brand new people on and after January 1st, they will be in a new tier of benefits that works a little bit differently for their pension benefits eventually when they retire. For those folks, their pension benefit will now be in two different components. We are going to call it a foundational benefit. That part works pretty similar to what we've always had, the defined benefit kind of plan that all of you, I assume, have. Then there will be a second component to what they eventually will draw in retirement called the supplemental benefit. That part will work more like a savings account, more like a 401k. The payout for unused sick days is going to work different only for these people that are in the new tier going forward into the future. So it really won't impact anyone because even new hires won't retire for many years into the future. But eventually for these people, when they retire, if they have unused sick days, they could still cash them out and get paid for those unused sick days the same. But they will not consider that as part of their final salary that calculates their pension income for the rest of their life. they could cash that out and deposit that into their supplemental benefit account. In other words, cash it out, you get paid for the days, you could put that into something like a 401k, and then it could sit there and earn interest and be invested for a while before you draw down. In that way, there is still an incentive to have some unused sick days when you retire, and you still get a financial benefit from that in retirement, but it will work very differently from how it works for probably all of you who are not going to be in this new system. House Bill 312 deals with the Open Records Act. It changes a lot of the rules on how school districts have to release records when someone requests and makes an open records request. From now on, only state residents and news organizations can make a request. This is a very important thing for us because I literally just earlier this morning, I was dealing with a question from a district where someone just sent in a request for lots and lots of records, like any emails to the superintendent about a certain topic. And it's someone from out of state, it's some group from out of state that's probably making the same kind of request to literally every superintendent in every public school district across America for some sort of research. Some of those are very time consuming to respond to, very burdensome, quite frankly, for staff to drop what they're doing and respond to this when it's someone not even from Kentucky, and who knows the reason why they're asking for it. So we see this as a benefit so that only Kentucky residents and news organizations now can make requests that you have to respond to. It allows requests to come in by email. It gives the school district a couple of extra days of time to respond to a request. It moves it up from 3 days up to 5 days to gather everything together and respond, which also is a good thing. House Bill 382 was another bill that appropriated some state money for school districts outside of the budget bill. House Bill 382 gives $140 million in state money to pay for all-day kindergarten in this school year, the 21-22 school year, out to all the districts. Of course, you know, almost every district already provides full-day kindergarten. A couple of districts have it in some schools, but not others because of space issues. Districts have done that many, many years. The state has only paid for half of that cost, and districts have picked up the other half from local money and other money they have. For just this 1 year, the state is appropriating money to pay for full-day kindergarten. This does not make that change permanent going into the future. However, next session, several legislators have told us they will file a bill to make this permanent. But even when they do, whether or not the state actually appropriates the money in any given year will always depend on the budget bill. So every 2 years going into the future in perpetuity, all of us will always still have to advocate with our General Assembly to continue appropriating money to pay for full-day kindergarten out in all the districts. Nothing can require the General Assembly in Frankfort to pay any certain amount of money for something every year permanently. It always depends on the budget bill every 2 years. There's a formula in state statute that determines how much money the state is supposed to reimburse districts for running school buses. Well, that formula is only about half funded right now. The budget bill passes and basically says, well, fully funding for that would be, just for sake of argument, $100 million. However, this year we're only going to give $50 million. We're only going to give half of it. That can still happen to all-day kindergarten funding into the future. It will always be something that we have to ask for every year. And that's just the nature of the beast and how the budget works. House Bill 405 established a school funding task force to study how we fund public education in Kentucky, how it works, compare it to other states, and come up with recommendations for ways that it might change. That is mostly legislators on that task force. However, 3 local school board members and 3 local superintendents have been invited to participate as sort of unofficial non-voting members. That task force has already started meeting. They have met twice. They will meet at least once a month between now and January. There's been a lot of good information presented so far on how all of this works. They may or may not make recommendations for changes next session. That bill also appropriated $10 million in state money just in this next school year to help districts fix school facilities that were damaged by flooding that happened back in February. House Bill 556 was another one that gave us some money, or it will, it hasn't yet. House Bill 556 gave $127 million from the federal ARPA funds. That is some of the COVID relief money from the federal government that Congress passed. Out of all the money in ARPA, the American Rescue Plan that is coming to Kentucky, this bill gives $127 million of it to pay for certain school replacement and renovation costs from the SFCC, the School Facilities Construction Commission here in Frankfort. It also appropriates $75 million in state money for certain LAVEC renovations in the next school year. LAVEC, if you've never heard that acronym, stands for Local Area Vocational Education Center. Those are the locally operated CTE centers. That's the technical term for them. This is a $75 million pool of money that districts can ask for. Each district can make a request and get up to $10 million to make renovations if they own and operate one of these local tech centers. The process for both of these pieces of funding, the $127 million and the $75 million, is underway right now. We don't have that federal money in our hands yet to give out, but we know the districts that will get it as soon as it comes. They've already decided that. And the LAVEC pool of money, districts right now are putting together their applications, and the deadline isn't due for them to ask for that money yet. But still good news. Okay, the last 16 minutes that we have, I'm wrapping up pretty quickly now. House Bill 563 was the school choice bill. We called it the omnibus school choice legislation because it had two big pieces of the bill that were sort of totally separate from each other, but both related to school choice in some way. The first big piece of that bill is going to make some changes to non-resident student enrollment. The way that a school district may or may not allow a non-resident student that lives in some other school district in Kentucky to enroll and attend school in their district, and whether or not, if they do, whether or not they can count that student in attendance so that they can get state SEEK money for them. So this bill changes how that works, but that has not taken effect yet. That part of the bill takes effect July 1, 2022, 1 year from now. So for this school year that's about to start, absolutely nothing about non-resident enrollment is changing. The way that works now will continue working the same way for the next school year. And then into the future, at that point, we will see some changes. This totally second unrelated part of this bill created the Education Opportunity Account Tax Credit Program. We used to call this the Scholarship Tax Credit Program. The name changed a little bit to the EOA program. That passed and is now in law. However, that part of the bill is in court. A group of people has challenged that and has alleged that that is unconstitutional under our state constitution. That lawsuit is just beginning. We have not even had the first hearing about it yet, frankly. So it's much too soon to predict if the courts will throw that part of the bill out or not. But we will be watching that lawsuit go forward. That lawsuit does not challenge any part of the non-resident enrollment changes. So, to summarize very quickly, as I said already, the non-resident enrollment part of the bill does not take effect until next July. When it takes effect, it will allow each local school board to allow non-residents to enroll in their school, and it will allow them to count them in attendance and get state funding for them. But districts will not be able to discriminate between non-resident pupils. They will have to take basically anyone who applies, essentially. But each district could set its own enrollment capacity, which is not necessarily the capacity in the school building. That doesn't necessarily mean how many desks you have free in your building. You could base your capacity on the funding you have, the teachers you have, and whatnot. And it does not require districts to accept non-residents. A school board could decide that it simply did not want to take any non-residents, and it would not have to. You can see there's some more parts of it. It did not change anything about how a district can charge tuition for non-residents or not. As I said, it does not require any board to accept non-residents. Any non-resident student who enrolls in a district that they don't live in would not be eligible to participate in athletics in that school district for 1 year starting at the date of transfer. That is a change that's not really how that works currently, and that may change next session. All of this might change next session. Okay, really quickly, I will talk about the other part of this bill that was extremely controversial. The entire bill was controversial, but this part especially, the EOA program, or the tax credit program. I will not read all of these bullet points to you, but if you have the materials, this summarizes how that really works and what this really means. In short, this would create a new state income tax credit for individual people or business entities to donate money to an account granting organization or an AGO. That organization is like a nonprofit charity group. The money they get donated to them, they could then give out to students who apply to get money to help pay for various things that I'll show you on the next chart. The person who donates the money could get a tax credit for their state income taxes. So basically they will pay less money to the state general fund on their income tax once a year based on how much money they donate to this fund. The idea is the same as if you make a charitable contribution now. You can deduct that from your income. This would be much more generous though. It would basically mean a whole lot more to that person if they got a tax credit versus a tax deduction for making a donation to this specific kind of program. You can see here a list of things that a student could possibly use money from an AGO for. It is not just private school tuition. In prior years, that's all it was for. This year, the bill says you can use it for all sorts of things. Some things that public school students might be able to get donated money and use it for. You see them there, a long list of things. They got more support for passing this bill from some legislators this year because it wasn't just for private school tuition, it was also for things like this. However, on this slide, the list continues. The last bullet point on this slide shows that it still could possibly, the donated money that someone gets a tax credit for, could possibly still be used to help some students pay for private school tuition in Kentucky based on where they live. It is not statewide. It would only be for students who are residents of a county with a population of 90,000 people or more in the 2010 census. The counties that is listed there at the very end of that slide. So it's not statewide, it's only in our larger urban areas, which is where most of the private schools are concentrated anyway in some of those places. I continue explaining here more about how the tax credit would work and what this really does. It's funny, in the last bullet point on this slide, I said if any part of the bill is challenged in state court, parents of students who would like to get this money could go in and defend it in court. That has now happened. When I put this together, even very recently, that really hadn't happened yet, but now a lawsuit has been filed. It is sitting at the Franklin Circuit Court here with Judge Philip Shepard in Frankfort, really at the beginning stages, and we can't predict when he will issue a ruling or what that might look like. Okay, wrapping up really quickly now, House Bill 574 is a piece of legislation that makes a lot of changes to how we do elections in Kentucky and how people vote in Kentucky. It makes a lot of changes. I will not summarize any of them except this one bullet point on the slide here that involves schools. Now, part of that bill put into permanent law what you see quoted here. It says that local, state, and federal tax dollars shall not be used to advocate in partial terms for or against any public question that appears on the ballot. That includes local school districts and local, state, or federal tax dollars that a local school board has. In other words, from now on, a school board that maybe, let's just say, for example, had a tax increase that was subject to a recall vote that we talked about earlier. So now everyone is going to go to vote and it's going to say, are you in favor of this tax increase from your local school board, yes or no? Because of this legislation now, the school district will not be able to use any public funding it has to advertise for people to, like, please vote yes for the tax increase, or to have put yard signs out in people's yards that says, please support the tax increase. You would not be able to do that anymore. You would have to maybe fundraise to kind of generate support for such a thing. The full text of every bill that I've mentioned, all the bill numbers I mentioned and summarized very briefly, you can look up the actual text of all of those bills and any summary documents at this website, legislature.ky.gov. That is the website of the Legislative Research Commission, LRC, the staff of our State General Assembly. You can go onto that website and look under bills, and then you could click on the 2021 regular session. And then you could look up any of the House bills and Senate bills I mentioned here if you want to read through them. Also, in closing, to send a message to your legislator, your representative or senator, or any of the state legislators, you can call this 1-800 number. It is free. An actual human being will answer the phone and take your message. It will not be some recording. If you do not know who your legislator is, that operator will help you find out who they are based on your address. You can also do things like say, send this message to all legislators, or send this message to every member of the Education Committee. That operator will take your message verbatim, write it down, and send exactly what you say in an automated system of emails to all of those legislators. It basically has regular business hours year-round. You could call them today. They have extended hours late in the evening during session because of the high volume of calls. I encourage you to put this number in your phones. Please save this in your cell phone under LRC message line so that in an emergency during session, when you see something on Twitter from KSBA or from any other group, or you just read a news article about something and it says, well, they're debating a bill that would do this, they might vote on it this evening. Please put this in your phone so that without having to try to look it up, you can just get to this quickly and send an urgent message, whether you are for or against whatever they're talking about. This really does have an impact. Sometimes, you know, there's a big movement behind some bill and there's a lot of outside support or even outside Kentucky support for something. But really on most things, so few people actually call and talk to their legislators and leave messages that on a lot of things, even 5 messages from an actual constituent, a name and an address that they know is one of their voters in their hometown for or against something is sometimes enough to really sway votes, or at least get them to slow down and give some more thought to something. It really does make a difference. So please put that in your phones and stay involved. That is the end of the PowerPoint presentation. Let me see what happens next. I've ended the slideshow. Let me stop sharing. Okay, I think, Cindy, help me out. Have I stopped sharing my screen?
You stop sharing, you're good. And I think we just have a couple minutes to take any questions if anybody has it. I didn't see any in the chat, so I think we're good on that front.
So I'm only catching up on the chat now. It looks like someone was finally able to get to the slides and see them, I think.
Yes, we uploaded your slides, I think right before you started presenting. So I shared that link in the chat a couple times.
All right, well, if there's any questions or comments, Cindy can find me after the presentation. You can forward any questions or comments on to me if there's something you wanted to ask about or email me with. I'm happy to try to help. And otherwise, thank you all for your coming to this session and paying attention. Thank you for immediately storing that number in your phones and staying in touch with your legislators. Like I said, next session will be a budget session. There is a question in the chat. This is good for our last 3 minutes. Do you have an idea if any of the pre-filed bills on banning CRT will pass, critical race theory? 2 bills have been pre-filed already to come up for the next session that involve critical race theory. Actually, the bills do not actually use that term. It's just a long list of topics and things that teachers would be prohibited from teaching. One of the bills would allow people to have investigations done by the school district, and the school district might even have a fine if teaching on these topics was happening. Honestly, something about that topic almost definitely will pass next session. I do not think it will be one of these bills exactly the way they are now, but something about that topic will definitely be discussed, and very good chance that it will pass this session. There is a lot of interest behind it, a lot of pressure on legislators about it. Your local school board members, I can promise you, are being inundated with calls and emails and messages for and against this thing as well. So yes, to answer that, probably something will pass, but I don't exactly know quite what that will look like yet.
Okay.
Is this the last breakout for the day, or do you have another one?
No, there's one more breakout at I think 12, and then we have a general session to close the afternoon out. So
good deal. Well, Cindy, I'll turn it over to you for any kind of housekeeping messages, and just thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that's it. We want to thank you again, Eric. You always have great information for us, and thank you for presenting with us. And if there are no more questions, we will just go ahead and end this session. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Bye.
You know, it doesn't count if you don't wave goodbye.